All right. So what is your job during a research presentation? Well, from the perspective of your audience, that's the us here, your job is to explain to us what you've been studying and why you think it's interesting. I would say that that's my sort of best, extremely short summary of what a research talk is for, right? And what makes this difficult, things you need to keep in mind here, are that we may not know anything about your topic, and this is was meant for the in-class presentations in Bibliography 615, where we really have a broad diversity of students studying different topics, some of which I don't even know anything about. And so it's really important that you explain the concepts, the constructs, and the background information on your topic. If your talk is entitled, Flipped Classroom Technologies and Communicative Language Teaching, you better be explaining what a flipped classroom is and what communicative language teaching is in your first couple slides. Otherwise, you're going to completely lose the people in the classroom who don't know about these ideas. Similarly, if your talk is on, lenition processes and word segmentation, you better be explaining to your audience what is lenition, what is a word segmentation experiment within the first few slides. Right? You also want to propose an interesting question here. And if you've done the outlining of your basic area skillfully, you'll be able to explain to people why your question is interesting just based on what they've learned from the previous, 10 slides or whatever. You're going to suggest some way or ways to probe these kinds of interesting questions that you've asked, and then explain what we could learn from various outcomes of the investigation. Right? And so in particular for this class where you're doing the research proposal, this is about as far as you'll get, right? You're going to talk about hypothetical outcomes and what we might learn from them. That's true in the paper as well, but you won't actually get to describe the outcomes that you've observed, and that's inevitable in this class. In any case, we're not ending up doing the research presentations this semester. Other points here, try to make your presentation interesting. I'm not always very good at this. I should take this own advice more myself. But use pictures, use charts, use tables, use audio or video stimuli if they're relevant. Give concrete examples of the things that you're studying. Don't just talk about the sentences or the linguistic materials that you're studying in very vague, abstract terms or in linguistic terminology. Give some examples of the actual sentences that you're talking about, or the actual words, or the actual sounds that you're talking about, and do your best to define things clearly, even things that you think people might know in the audience. It never hurts to have a definition if there's any kind of technical terminology involved. Okay. These are some points from Dr. Robles Puente that I just think are really useful, well done pointers here. So these slides belong to him. So you might remember from our discussion of conferences, there's really two kinds of research presentations that get done at a conference. There are research talks. If you're at a large conference, you might have multiple parallel sessions going on at once, which will each have a speaker going, and people sort of zoom in and out between, not literally zoom, not the kind of Zoom that we use nowadays, but they will walk in and out of different rooms where the different sessions are going and try to catch this talk in room 1 and this other talk in room 3 and so on and so forth. Smaller conferences will generally only have one talk going at once, and the whole audience is just sitting there watching you. There can be quite different length talks depending on what kind of a conference it is. 20 minutes, I would say, is pretty standard at most linguistics conferences. At very large conferences, you can get shorter talks than that. Some more in-depth sort of specialist conferences will have longer talks, like 30 minutes or even an hour in some places. And then there's usually time for questions at the end of each talk. 10 minutes is pretty standard for most kinds of conferences. So you're going to have to be ready to answer questions and defend your work for 10 minutes at the end of your presentation. We actually normally do this in the bibliography class as well, although we're going to miss out on it this semester. Posters, as I mentioned in that earlier slideshow, are presented all simultaneously in a large hall. with lots of people putting up their poster presentations at once and people walking around between the posters. You get to decide how long you're going to talk about your poster to a passerby, but you want to make it as quick as possible so that you can hold their interest and that you're not detaining them, right? So 20 minutes is probably too long for you to explain your poster to somebody. 5 minutes might be more like it. And then obviously the kinds of interactions you get in a poster presentation are going to depend entirely on who comes to your poster. So it's sort of an interesting surprise. If you end up presenting a talk at a conference or in front of any other kind of important audience, what are some things that are important in giving a research presentation? Well, easier said than done. Be confident. How do you get to be confident? Well, you work really hard on your research and you're sure that it's sound. That's sort of step one. You are prepared. That is a great way to feel confident. You practice your presentation in front of a mirror. Give it to a wall. Give it in your hotel room if you've traveled to the conference. I've been doing this for, I don't know, like 12 years. And before that, I was a performing musician. So I've had lots of time to get used to performing things in front of people. I still get nervous. I still practice my presentation out loud in my hotel room every time I go to a conference or every time I go to give a talk in a linguistics department. I am giving my talk to an empty room the day of or the night before. I know that I have my talk down in exactly the right amount of time, and I'm not surprised by anything that comes up in the slides or in the handout when I'm giving a talk. Right? Be very careful with your time limits. Normally at a conference, you'll have a session chair whose job is to hold up little reminders when you get down to 10 minutes or 5 minutes or 2 minutes. They'll hold up a little piece of paper that says 5 minutes. And you should never, ever, ever go past your allotted time. People, unfortunately, do this at academic conferences. It is totally unacceptable and nobody should do this. You want to, importantly here, leave secondary information for later. What counts as secondary information? Well, anything that's a level of detail that isn't necessary for them to understand the broad outline of what you've done and can't be fit into the allotted presentation time. Put it at a slide at the end, right? Put all the different kinds of specific details that you might be interested in talking about after the end of your presentation. Then if somebody asks about it during the question period, you say, oh, I actually have a slide about that. And you fast forward down to that slide and people go, wow, that person was really prepared for their presentation and for the discussion section. Right? Be as clear as possible. I mean, that's what this entire lecture is about pretty much. In linguistics, it's mostly PowerPoint presentations these days. Although paper handouts are still acceptable, especially in theoretical linguistics. You will definitely find people using paper handouts at conferences. That is considered quaint and kind of hilarious by researchers in most scientific fields, but that's the way linguistics is. You often want to have people give them access to your data so that they can keep looking at it and puzzling at it while you're talking about it. This is much easier with a paper handout than it is with a PowerPoint presentation. And while I get that PowerPoint is sort of considered to be more modern and handouts are old-fashioned, it's often the case, especially with linguistics where you're looking at linguistic data, it's often more effective to give talks with paper handouts, is my take on that. Those of you who've taken phonology with me know that I do almost everything in theoretical phonology with paper handouts. There's a reason for that. I think it just creates better presentations than PowerPoint slides. PowerPoint slides are really hard to master. It's a difficult form. It can be done very well, but there are far more terrible PowerPoint presentations out there than there are good PowerPoint presentations. And before you say anything, I don't exempt myself from that. I know that I often teach better with a blackboard or with a piece of paper than I do with PowerPoint. PowerPoint really has a constraining effect on the way that you present things and the way that you explore things. At some point in your presentation, whether it's a handout or a PowerPoint or your talk or your research paper, you should be giving an outline of what you're going to be doing in the paper. This is really helpful, as I mentioned above, to let the listener or the audience situate themselves with regard to what's coming up. You want to lay out your questions and hypotheses clearly, use graphs and graphics and tables to help you explain your point, especially in this project, you're unlikely to be having detailed quantitative results. But if you are going to be talking about different patterns of results you might see, you can make a fake graph or a fake figure that shows what you would expect them to look like, because it's often much clearer to explain quantitative patterns of results and even qualitative patterns using a picture than it is using words. This is often really useful. Then, of course, hopefully, you're going to answer your research question and summarize what you found and why it's important. Of course, in this class, you probably won't come to any firm answers this semester, but you'll talk about possible answers and what they would mean if you found them. You might want to think about potential questions your audience may ask. Why? Because it's incredibly nerve-wracking to be sort of quizzed or grilled about your research presentation afterwards. It can be very, very scary, especially if you don't know the people in the audience. There's always this anxiety of like, what if somebody asks me a question and I don't know the answer? Well, think about questions. Think about what people are probably going to ask you. Oftentimes, you'll be able to guess at least one or two questions that you're going to get. And you can have, if not a full answer memorized, you can have at least some preparation done with regard to those questions. And the answer to the question, what if I don't know the answer, is, that's life. Just say, I don't know. That's perfectly acceptable. There's sort of this attitude, especially amongst graduate students and younger academics, that if somebody asks you a question and you don't know the answer, everybody's going to think you're stupid. And that is just not true. It's completely normal for somebody to ask a question about your project that you just don't know the answer to. Sometimes I get questions when I give conference talks where I don't even really understand the question, right? And so what do you do in that case? The last thing you should do is to pretend to know the answer. That is what you don't want to do. Everybody will be able to tell that you're pretending to know the answer. It does not make you look good. It doesn't make you look confident. It makes you look like dismissive and insecure. So you acknowledge that you're not sure what the answer to the question is. Maybe if you have some thoughts about how you could learn the answer, maybe mention that. Maybe ask the questioner if they think they know the answer and what they had in mind. These are all acceptable things to do. If you really don't even understand what they're asking you, and this does happen sometimes, it happens to me, try repeating their question back to them bit by bit and asking them for clarification until you have understood what they're asking. So you asked me this question, so by this thing, did you mean this? And turn it back on them, make them explain the question more clearly. Take notes when people are asking you questions at a research presentation. This can be really useful because, oftentimes you're sort of on an adrenaline high and you're thinking really fast and a little bit nervous, and it flies by the time where you're taking questions. But if somebody brings up something really important, it's good to remember that, and you might not remember it later, given how sort of action-packed these sessions can be. So it's a good idea to write down points that come up during these question-answer sessions, right? Super important point. Know your audience, right? So where are you presenting, right? If you're going to a conference, is it a broad conference? Is it like the entire discipline of TESOL? The entire discipline of linguistics? Is it a more specific thing? Is there a subfield? Is it a conference on French linguistics? Is it a conference on generative syntax? So on and so forth. Know how broad or how narrow your the conference is, and use that to predict how knowledgeable in your specific area you think your audience might be. If I'm giving a talk at a general Romance linguistics conference, I'm going to pitch that really differently than if I'm giving a talk at a phonetically based phonology conference or something like that. Explain your terminology that you're using if you need to. If you're using lots of technical terms, explain them, define them. Explain the methodology if you don't think people will know the kinds of methodology that you're talking about. If you're giving linguistic examples, then gloss them morpheme by morpheme if you don't think your audience necessarily knows the language that you're talking about. If you're presenting at a Spanish linguistics conference and you're giving examples in Spanish, probably it's okay to go without English glosses. But if it's a general linguistics conference, you need a gloss of every linguistic example. And then finally, there are job talks, which generally are research presentations that you give when you apply for a full-time academic job. And it's unlikely that anybody in this class will be giving a job talk in the next couple of years based on research, although you might at some point be asked to give a job talk if you're applying for teaching jobs, and that talk will be usually about your teaching philosophy, right? So at a talk like that, you might have teachers from very, very different disciplines in the room, and you want to make sure that you can bring them all in by explaining the more specific issues that come up in teaching specific subjects. All right, so you've now given your talk, you've succeeded. What next? Well, if you're at a conference, then you're all done in terms of the nerve-wracking stuff. Like, all the scary part is over. All you need to do now is hang out at the conference and meet people and talk to them. Hopefully, people saw your presentation or saw your poster. You'll now have something to start conversations about, and you can learn things, a lot of things, from people who have seen your research. They might have suggestions on different ways that you could pursue your research. They might know more than you do about the topic. They might have some related topic that they know a lot about, and they want to suggest something to you. This is a really valuable thing that you get out of conferences. Meeting people who work not necessarily directly in your area, but maybe in related areas, and building a network of professional contacts is one of the most satisfying and most useful things you can do in academia. And once you're home, after you made it through the conference, then go back to your paper or your proposal and think about ways to improve it. This is the other sort of purpose of a conference, besides all the things I've talked about so far, is it usually makes your work better. So that's about research presentations and conferences. This is from Dr. Robles Puente. It's a slightly more complete sort of checklist of things that you would probably want to include in a conference talk. And this is also going to be true in general for research papers. You will want to include all of these things with the exception of thank you note to the audience. This is something that people often do at the end of a conference talk, is they say thank you for your attention. You probably don't want to do that in an actual paper manuscript, although you might want to put in acknowledgments of people who helped you during the course of writing the paper, and those are basically thank yous as well. So the last part of this week's materials, I'm going to give a research presentation about a fairly narrow technical topic in phonetics and phonology and psycholinguistics. And I'm going to see if I can give a coherent research presentation in 20 minutes following the guidelines that I've laid out here.